Okay, everyone, we're going to jump right into things. So we do have the difficult job of being right before lunch, but don't worry, we will get there. It is my immense pleasure to introduce Elise Burton, who's an assistant professor at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. Try saying that 5 times really fast. She's a historian of the life sciences in the modern Middle East, focusing on developments in genetics, evolutionary biology, physical anthropology, and medicine during the 20th and 21st centuries. She's also one of the incoming editors of ISIS, the journal. Elise and I overlapped in Toronto, and I got to TA an awesome class with her called History of Public Health in the Middle East. We definitely had some COVID teaching bonding going on over there. Okay.
Enable the waiting room. So now I think that will just be able to join that. Do you have, oh, right, so you don't have any notes on that, there's no.
No, so I'm gonna read it on the sponsor,
Okay,
but to move it, I'll be pushing the air.
let me go look at it. I'm just gonna share.
Elise,
Hello, how are you?
good. I'm scanning to see if I saw you in the audience earlier, but my anger. You want Melanie to come and give a hand for? Is it working? This thing's not on.
Yes, it is, yes, it is, yes, it is. You can see it there.
But why is the light not on? That's weird.
It is illuminated.
The eyes are on.
The eyes are on, they track more being.
Wait.
At some point, not tomorrow.
Yeah, I might, why don't get,
Right?
Leslie to join in too.
Yes.
She was gonna do the next week.
Yeah.
Next day and she has to leave.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we'll,
Yeah, later on today, can't do it now, but yes, we'll. Maybe at lunch.
Yeah, let's do that.
No, actually, now that I figured it out, so now it's just. Yeah.
So you don't need any help?
No, it's all right. Wonderful.
Nice
I've got-
pro.
I've got the waiting room. I'm all thanks to Sarah for showing me how to.
Yes.
People incoming.
The thing that's it wasn't recorded, right?
Yes, it was. I think so. It says it's being recorded.
Oh, the previous one. Wasn't recorded.
I think it said it was automatically.
Wasn't it?
Okay.
But that's what happened.
You can check on the Zoom portal.
You can do that like way before.
Yeah, if you go on the Zoom portal and click on the session, you can see it's recorded because you should be able to rewatch it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I took too many lessons about Zoom.
I'm already having trauma.
Oh my God, stop.
No, okay, it says watch it, so you're good. I think it just takes time to.
Yeah,
load
Yeah,
it.
it does.
Yeah.
It takes a while before the
Yeah.
file should.
Because I'm like, it's all the cloud, right? It's
Yeah.
not like it's being loaded anymore on our computers. It is being loaded in the cloud.
Yes, that's
So-
right.
All right, I'm going to admit all and then.
But I'll be back in the door. Teamwork.
Yeah.
The German in me is like, okay, sorry, I got a little too Dutch.
I'm just gonna say, that's a long time.
Yeah. I went to the Italian meeting, the Italian history science meeting.
That's.
It was quite an experience. Yeah.
Maybe here. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, that's why I figured, I'm like, you're right there. You can't find it.
No, but, getting so. Right, it's sort of things that bring all you. I think that's something that's, but then.
The separation, yeah, my favorite is. Sorry. Do you want some?
Bless you.
Okay, Megan, I'll wait for you to tell me when to go.
I think it would be, well, I mean, there are people trickling in, so. They want to give it another, so.
Yeah. I'm just gonna say hi to Matt. That haven't seen him in literally. Yeah. Wow.
Just, yeah. It didn't show up on the Zoom.
I see.
I don't know why.
We have a wireless mic.
Hello, hi everyone. Be here, we're just testing the mic, check 1, 2, do you want to give it a quick? You can hear us in the back, can you give us a thumbs up? Check, you're ready? Yeah, great, thank you. Okay. Okay, everyone, we're going to jump right into things. So we do have the difficult job of being right before lunch, but don't worry, we will get there. It is my immense pleasure to introduce Elise Burton, who's an assistant professor at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. Try saying that 5 times really fast. She's a historian of the life sciences in the modern Middle East, focusing on developments in genetics, evolutionary biology, physical anthropology, and medicine during the 20th and 21st centuries. She's also one of the incoming editors of ISIS, the journal. Elise and I overlapped in Toronto, and I got to TA the awesome class with her called History of Public Health in the Middle East. We definitely had some COVID teaching bonding going on over there. But at lunch, you have to ask Elise about the escape room she created at the university. It's really cool. We're going to save the questions for lunch, so I will hand things over to Elise with talking about rethinking forms and scales of scientific collaboration. Elise, the floor is yours.
Sarah, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me here. No thanks for scheduling me to go right after Jim Secord. It's probably the hardest act. So my talk is going to be a little bit more half-baked. It's not as programmatic as the excellent talk he set us off with. But I'm hoping that I can show some examples of how to address several of the critical questions that Jim raised for us. So to do that, I'll be focusing on a thematic problem that's been driving my work since around 2016. And that is when we invoke the term scientific collaboration, what do we really mean by that? So even now, we're surrounded by institutional and also different kinds of political demands to do science and other kinds of scholarship, including history, right, in collaboration. So what does that really mean in practice? Okay. Obviously, at its most basic level, when we think about collaboration, scholarly or scientific collaboration, we think about forging relationships in which people are working together in some way to produce knowledge. And implicitly, these relationships are also supposed to involve the circulation of knowledge, but also often of resources, right? And the study of collaborative relationships in science so far has been mostly dominated by sociologists and anthropologists of science. And they've noted for us that contemporary transnational scientific collaboration between, for example, the global north and the global south often tends to function in a neo-colonial way. So as someone who's a historian of science in the modern Middle East, I've paid close attention, firstly, to that kind of scholarship. Historians, of course, have not neglected the emergence of an idea of scientific collaboration. And most often, historians have project this contemporary terminology of collaboration or collaborators into the past. as an analytical category that we could use to describe different kinds of people who are involved in knowledge production and circulation. But so far, I don't think that the way of using the idea of collaboration has been taken up as much as some of the scholarship on diplomacy and science. Now, in my own research, I've been most interested in thinking through scientific collaboration specifically as an actors category, which mostly limits me to the 20th century. So I'm part of the problem that Jim identified, being sort of an incorrigible modernist, the way I've done my work so far. But I think what I'm going to present today will hopefully raise other questions that can be productively taken up across a broader span of chronology. So I'm interested in comparing, firstly, the rhetoric of collaboration to the actual practice of collaboration. What is it that collaborators really do together? When scientists agree to collaborate with each other, what kinds of political, social, to those questions, right? And the reason that there's so many answers that you can come up with is because every instance of scientific collaboration, we have to be analyzing them as an intersecting set of forms and scales of historical contingencies and political factors. So again, hopefully I'm showing one of the ways that Jim mentioned, that Debbie Cohen has used about looking always at multiple scales of analysis. Okay. So this, again, this is not meant to be like a programmatic identification of what scales are or what forms of collaboration always have to be. But some of the ways of thinking about forms and scales in my own work in addressing scientific working relationships is I thought, on the one hand about formal, organized types of scientific collaboration, which are usually created through some kind of diplomatic or institutional initiative. And so the scientists that participate then are sometimes willing agents in this process, and sometimes they're sort of coerced into participating into organized scientific collaboration. There's also, of course, informal, highly contingent forms of collaboration that happen, right? These are the kind of individual relationships that are forged between scholars, okay? And what we might want to consider there is how looking at these contingent forms of collaboration might open us up to the idea of new participants, right, in the production and circulation of knowledge, right? So when we think about scientific collaborators, who gets to be called a scientific collaborator, we usually think about relationships between people who have the social position of professional scientists. Okay. And that's especially true, right, if we are limiting ourselves to actors categories. But also we can see lots of cases where scientists have deemed other people that they worked with, such as government officials, diplomats, community leaders, even sometimes human research subjects, as being their collaborators. And then regardless of the type or form of scientific collaboration, again, we always need to understand it in terms of scale. And so I've thought about scale in terms of both geography and as a process of analysis, okay? So I'll sort of be haphazardly using terms macro, meso, micro. We can ask if it really should only be 3 levels of scale, right? Maybe there are 7, there could be any number, right? But the way I've tried to sort of parse them out in the kinds of materials I work with is to look, of course, for macro, we're thinking global, we're thinking international, especially if it's trans-regional, across very wide geographic spaces. At a meso level, we're thinking in terms of national spaces. So usually the kinds of collaborations that are formed within a national space, so maybe across different institutions, are designed to be part of a process of sort of regional integration. These are especially true when you have the kind of states that I work on in the Middle East, where nation building was a process that was forming at the same time that the idea of scientific collaboration emerged historically. And then, of course, we have this micro level, which I think for those of us who have been working more along the lines of complementary social and intellectual histories have been most exciting for us, right? When we delve into our sources that are, for example, correspondence, individual field notes, right? The documents, records relating to specific institutions and field sites. That's where we start to see the real complicated frictions, which both Jim and lots of other scholars have articulated, that happen within scientific working relationships. Okay. Now, the reason it's important to always bring all the scales back in, even to our analyses at the micro level of scientific collaboration, is because it's so important to understand what Jim was talking about in terms of power relations in science, right? So on the one hand, when we look only at a micro level, at the kinds of conflicts that might emerge between individuals engaged in scientific collaboration, there's often a way in which our actors will kind of write off these conflicts as issues of personality conflicts or cultural differences, right? However, it's only by looking at, for example, the scales of geopolitics or local political economy at a meso level that we can understand where a lot of the micro level conflict is actually coming from, and how we can understand the effects of all these things on the way that knowledge is articulated and then later circulated in different parts. Okay. So now I'll try to show how I try to balance all of these different things in my own work. And for the examples that I'm discussing today, I'm using Iran as an anchoring point, specifically Iran between the 1950s to 1970s, which is a very important, tumultuous moment right in Iranian political history. Okay. Now, why would it be useful for us to think with Iran when we're considering these complex questions about scientific collaboration? I put forth to you that so far, many of our very exciting new models of knowledge circulation involve contexts and locations of European colonialism, right? Or other kinds of forms of European or American economic imperialism. And also we have some really interesting cases discussing Christian religious missions, right, in different parts of the world. But Iran offers us a really interesting case because it doesn't exactly fit into any of the frameworks that we've used so far there. All of them remain analytically relevant to the case of Iran in the 20th century. But Iran has its own deep legacy as an imperial power right up until the 19th century. Iran has a highly diverse geography and society. It was never officially colonized by European powers. And yet by the early 20th century, Iran was militarily weakened and economically beholden to multiple European powers, especially Britain and Russia. So it's fascinating sometimes when you talk to Middle East historians, and you'll say that you're using, kind of post-colonial frameworks to understand Iran. You'll say, but Iran was never colonized, right? It's a very different sense. But there's a lot of ways in which some ideas from post-colonial scholarship are relevant to what's going on in Iran. So we posited, for example, Iranian historians of science, the idea of semi-coloniality. Okay, Iran was a semi-colonial space. So even though it wasn't directly under the administration of any European colonial power, many Iranian elites believed that only by emulating European military institutions, public health laws, and economic systems, only by emulating Europe could they reverse the country's declining fortunes in the 19th century. And so in that sense, many of the patterns that we see in formally colonized spaces, we also see them occurring inside Iran. The Iranian government hired European teaching and advising personnel to staff Iran's first modern university, to advise on all different kinds of government reforms. And particularly pertinent for the first case study I'll be looking at, the Iranians were highly suspicious of bringing in British and Russian advisors. So they often preferred other kinds of Europeans, the Austrians, the Italians, and especially the French. These were their preferred sources of educating and advising. The Qajar government in the 19th century also sent many Iranian students to study science in France. So there's a long-term influence of French science in particular on Iran. And so by the end of the First World War, Iran has a growing class of Francophile, indeed Francophone elites who really admire French science. And this is what leads to the foundation of the Iranian Pasteur Institute. What's particularly interesting about this first case of the Iranian Pasteur Institute is that it's not a straightforwardly colonial institution like several of the Pasteur Institutes in North Africa and in Vietnam. This institute was actually created at the request of Iranian government delegates who actually went to Paris in 1919 and asked members of the Paris Pasteur Institute to help set up a branch in Tehran. Okay. So even though it was technically set up as an organ of the Iranian government, the Iranian Pasteur Institute nevertheless still functioned as a mechanism for the French to spread a sort of political and cultural influence. So even though it was staffed primarily by Iranians, salaries were paid by the Iranian government, they hired, for example, a French director. Okay, and so there was a French director controlling the day-to-day work of the Iranian employees, and there was also a French advisory committee at the Institute of Paris to sort of give their counsel as to how the Iranian government should be running the institute. Okay. So in the first part of the talk, I'll be looking closely at that institution in the early 1950s as a hub of international scientific collaborations between French, American, and Iranian scientists. Then in the latter half of the talk, I'll cover some of my research in progress. So my first book was about the history of human genetics in the Middle East. And in that book, I focused extensively on how international scientific collaborations of Middle Eastern geneticists shaped and were shaped by regional concepts of race and national identity. But during that research, I stumbled across historical examples of Indian and Japanese geneticists working in Iran, which made me ask myself, have I been too focused on scientific relationships between the West and the Middle East? Like, this is a disease that most historians of the Middle East have, right? Why am I not thinking more about scientific connections between the Middle East and the rest of Asia? I mean, even using the geographical term Middle East as opposed to alternatives like West Asia has biased me toward looking in a certain direction. So now what I'm doing is I'm building on my previous work to examine trans-Asian scientific collaborations and consider how they might be shaped by perhaps different kinds of politics and ideas about human races. And so I am still looking at the field of human genetics, but also expanding into other sciences such as archaeology. So I will wrap up by looking at where I am right now in that research. Okay. All right, so first I'll rush through what's an extremely complex story at the Iranian Pasteur Institute. And for the full details, you can read this article, which was published in ISIS in 2021, well before I became the editor. It's exciting to get to talk a little bit about this paper. Jim got to talk about his most cited paper. I'm going to be talking about my least cited paper, but I would really like to have more engagement and commentary with some of the ideas I put forth in it. So the story about this paper is that I was already interested in the idea of scientific collaboration before writing it, but sort of serendipitous archival trip inspired me to look very closely at this idea of an active category of collaboration. So in 2019, I went to the Pasteur Institute archives in Paris to try to look at their records related to the branch in Iran. And specifically, I was closely examining the correspondence of Marcel Balthazar, who was the French director of the Iranian Institute between 1947 to 1961. And throughout his correspondence, he's constantly naming people as collaborators. Okay, so for example, in this is really just basically 2 paragraphs in one letter, over 2 pages, but it's all part of the same flow of thought. He names as collaborators, firstly, a professor at Tehran University. Then a little bit below, he says that he's in collaboration with the staff of the American Technical Cooperation Administration, active in Iran. And then at the very end, he says he's in collaboration with some American doctors in the US Army Medical Corps, in which he actually talks about doing an air raid in Bombay. This is a metaphor, to go collect monkeys for medical research. Okay. Now, in his other letters, he also refers to almost all of his Iranian employees at the Pasteur Institute as his collaborators. So maybe this was a general French habit, maybe it is a peculiarity of Balthazar. But this pattern of calling all kinds of different people collaborators really highlights how productive this work can be, right? It's a way for him to actually collapse all of the different power relationships that are surrounding the Institute at this moment in time. And from a more analytical distance, I found something rather troubling about the use of the term collaborator at this time and place in history. Okay, so without scientific qualifier, we have to remember that calling someone a collaborator can also have a really pejorative political connotation, right? As in collaboration, right? And Balthazar himself would have been no stranger to this meaning, as it was, you were talked about the collaborators of Vichy France, right? And similarly, in the context of decolonization, at which Iran in the early 1950s is kind of a forefront, anti-colonial nationalists would use the term collaborator to disparage their opponents, right? To sort of cast people as lackeys of European imperialism. So with that kind of discomfort in mind, I started digging deeper into what does it really mean to be a collaborator of the Iranian Pasteur Institute in the early 1950s. So firstly, as soon as Balthazar is appointed the director of the Tehran branch, he's really keen to expand the institute in multiple ways. Okay. He's invested in updating its physical laboratory buildings. He's trying to increase the institute's international scientific prestige. But behind the scenes, he's also very concerned about the role of the institute in promoting French culture, really soft power in Iran. So initially, Balthazar is quite successful at doing all this, but a huge problem emerges in 1951, when Iran, under the leadership of Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalizes its oil industry. So the British, who controlled oil production in Iran up until that point, then retaliate by freezing Iranian bank assets and blockading its oil ports, effectively crashing Iran's economy. So Balthazar at this moment suddenly has to face the hard fact that he actually doesn't work for the French government or a French institution. He is actually technically an employee. Okay. So at this economic crisis point, his own has to go around begging for money wherever he can to try to keep the institute running. And one of his main concerns that we see written in his correspondence is that he's very concerned that the funding problems at the institute are actually going to make France look bad to the Iranians he works with, right? So they're both like very micro and also macro level concerns in the way that Balthazar is thinking about this problem. Okay, Balthazar's biggest problem during the economic crisis is the construction of the Institute's new buildings. So loads of his correspondence between 1951 and 53 is about various schemes to try to fund the building once the Iranian government can't pay for it anymore. And that's how he gets involved with the American Foreign Aid Organization called Point 4, or the Technical Cooperation Administration. So this organization is supposed to be Truman's goodwill gesture to Mossadegh. But several of the employees of Point 4 also have a dual role for American intelligence. For example, people have pointed out it's hardly a coincidence that the headquarters of Point 4 were stationed exactly across from Mossadegh's personal home. And Balthazar is therefore a little reluctant to use money from Point 4 because of these political implications. So on the one hand, when he writes to Americans, like in the very first letter that I showed, he refers to these Point 4 people as collaborators in a positive way, right? Because they have agreed to financially support the Institute. But when he writes to his French colleagues in Paris, he describes these Americans essentially as threatening rivals to French influence in Iran. Okay. Balthazar's colleagues, when they write back, they show that they're very concerned that by taking money from Point 4, Balthazar was letting the Institute be colonized by Americans. They actually use this term of colonization. And so this, of course, reflects a broader Cold War concern by the French about America's growing international influence, which seems to be funded, with endless amounts of government money. So at the macro and meso scales of analysis, we can see how the scientific work of the Iranian Pasteur Institute was very deeply affected by Cold War geopolitics and all these economic problems that come with it. So now let's turn to the micro, right? These individual relationships among the Iranians who were deemed collaborators of Balthazar and the Pasteur Institute. So first, the first person who's named as a collaborator in that first letter is a man named Shamsuddin Mofidi, who's the professor at the University of Tehran. And in his letters, Balthazar refers to Mofidi as both his protege and a collaborator. Mofidi worked together with the Institute on some projects, specifically studying the bubonic plague. And Mofidi ends up earning a public health degree at Johns Hopkins University. In order to get this degree, he's actually fully funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Okay. Now, Balthazar is actually very concerned that his protege is sort of being lured away by the Americans and their money. Okay. So he begs his colleagues at the Paris Pasteur Institute to pay for Mofidi to come and visit them in Paris for 3 months. Okay. So there's a clear expression that Balthazar wants Mofidi to be impressed with French science and hospitality. Okay. But I think it's also important to note that Mofidi isn't really a victim of all this, right? He's not beholden to Balthazar in exactly the same way as the Iranian staff of the Pasteur Institute in Tehran. So let's talk a little more about those employees. Here are two of the staff scientists, Ali Mashoud and Mahmoud Bahmanyar. They're in one of the new labs once it finally does get built in 1954. And they're standing very far apart. It turns out that actually they really did not like each other. Balthazar, but however, they were both, seemingly quite loyal to Balthazar at the time that they were working there. Balthazar's letters constantly refer to both Bahmanyar and Mashoud as his collaborators. And to me, this seems odd, right? Because really, he's their manager. They don't have the choice of not working with him, right? Balthazar is the one who directs their day-to-day work, their overall career trajectories. They're not independent scientists who just happen to work on some projects with the Institute, right? So what should we make of this idea that they are collaborators? Okay. So some light was shed on this problem when I read the field journals of an American scientist, Daniel Carlton Gajdusek, who was a visiting researcher at the Iranian Institute for several months in 1954. Now, anyone who's read Warwick Anderson is aware that Gajdusek is, of course, a highly problematic character. However, his field journals did document in very great detail the personalities and social attitudes of these different Iranian scientists. And so the most important of them for Gajdusek was Mahmoud Bahmanyar, who effectively acted as Gajdusek's assistant during the months that Gajdusek was visiting Iran. So Bahmanyar had to set his own laboratory work aside. He accompanied Gajdusek to Afghanistan and rural parts of Iran to act as Gajdusek's interpreter, a fixer, and also a field worker, actually just doing the grunt work of collecting blood from research subjects for an American's project, okay? Now, by looking at this quote, we can see that Gajdusek himself actually developed a lot of respect for Bakhtiar. So early on in his field journals, Gajdusek refers to Bakhtiar as his assistant, okay? But by the time Gajdusek leaves, he's writing letters in which he calls Bakhtiar a collaborator, not only a collaborator, but the best, in fact, the only important one that Americans should be working with in Iran. However, on the other side of that, Gajdusek also documents the specific nature of some conflicts that he has with Bakhtiar. So Bakhtiar is a devoted Iranian nationalist. He was a supporter of Mossadegh, and he frequently expressed resentment against the United States for what happened in the coup against Mossadegh. And there's also instances when he shows a certain kind of chafing against Gajdusek's leadership of the project that they're working on together. There's a clear sense that he doesn't really like having to be a subordinate to an American scientist. He also sometimes privately expressed to Gajdusek issues that he had with Balthazar. Okay, so also a sense that he doesn't like having to work under a French director in what's supposed to be an Iranian government institution. Okay. Now, at the same time, you have to understand that Bakhtiar, again, is not really a victim or a subaltern, okay? He himself comes from this upper middle class urban background. And as we see from the field journals, Bakhtiar was actually deeply contemptuous of some of the human research subjects that the two of them interacted with, who were overwhelmingly these rural villagers. And so this photo is actually from their work in Afghanistan, but I think it nevertheless shows the kind of self-aware difference between the Iranian doctors, okay, and these rural villagers that they're working with, right? So there's these differences, right, in clothing and facial hair, and even just the way that they're looking at each other, right, which really mark out the doctors as these representatives of a westernized modernity, okay, commanding an authority to take the blood of these rural subjects who have very little access to health care. So all this culminates with Gajdusek being present at the Iranian Pasteur Institute for a clinical trial that they're running to test a new treatment for rabies. So as I detail more in the paper, but won't go into now, as was common for the time, this rabies trial is carried out in a scientifically rigorous but ethically very problematic way. Involving non-consensual experimentation on the set of rural Kurdish villagers who had been attacked by a wolf and were then quickly rushed over to the institute so that they could be used as part of this clinical trial. And so during that trial, Gajdusek insists on filming one of the patients who's going through the different symptoms of rabies and his eventual death. And he justifies this by saying that the film is going to be important as a means of teaching future doctors how to recognize the disease course of rabies. And then Gajdusek also orders one of the other Iranian attending doctors to autopsy the victim's brain, the patient's brain after he passes away. And this is in spite of the fact that the patient, when he was still lucid, expressed clear wishes to be brought home to his village to die, and also not to have his brain examined after death. However, what ends up happening is that the Iranian doctors follow Gajdusek's requests, not the requests of the patient. And so to me, this very disturbing incident reveals something that's very unpalatable about scientific collaboration. So when Balthazar and Gajdusek refer to Iranian scientists as collaborators, what we might like to do is to just take this term at face value and think that by calling them collaborators, the Iranians are just getting their due credit as scientists, as contributors to knowledge. But we should also feel a little bit uncomfortable because the political connotations of collaboration also seem to be quite applicable to what these Iranians are doing when they participate in ethical violations against their countrymen in order to take their place as internationally recognized scientists. But my hope is that this discomfort can be productive for us as historians to highlight the many complexities of this positionality occupied by Middle Eastern medical practitioners and the different ends to which they are using their social and intellectual status. All right, so now, for a quick look at some other Iranian scientists and scholars from a new vantage point, which is a Japanese one. So this is a study that may seem unusual, but actually I would argue is quite overdue. Because there's a long trend starting in the early 20th century in Iran, also in the Ottoman Empire in India, of admiring Japan. Okay, so after Japan defeated the Russian Empire in warfare in 1905, there was a sense that Japan was an example of an Asian country that had very rapidly and successfully modernized itself without necessarily becoming totally Europeanized. And so there were quite a few Iranian intellectuals who argued that Japan, rather than Europe, should be Iran's model for industrialization. And so in the pre-war period, there were a number of pan-Asian ideologies that gained some currency. Many intellectuals in Iran discussed the idea of shared cultural and even racial origins, linking together nations across the continent of Asia. But historians haven't really followed up with what happens to those pan-Asian ideas in the Middle East following World War II. And almost all historians of Middle Eastern science in the 20th century, including myself up till now, have focused only on the region's relations with Europe. So instead, I'm turning in a different direction to look at post-war trans-Asian scientific collaboration. Okay. I'm also working on some collaborations between Iran and India as part of this project, but I'm having to leave that aside for now. So looking at the Japanese case, at the macro level, these collaborations seem extremely exciting. Okay? So especially in the case of archaeology, there's a lot of diplomatic theatrics on both sides, both the Japanese and the Iranian, and also Iraqi side. So Iraq is also involved in these collaborations. So the very first Japanese excavation team to work outside of Japan after 1945 is this one, the Tokyo University Iraq-Iran Archaeological Expedition. It's the first excavation team sent by Japan to work in West Asia as opposed to East or Southeast Asia. And the most exciting part is that they were actually expressly invited to excavate there by the Iraqi and Iranian authorities. So this is quite different because at this point in time, in the Middle East, there was a lot of reluctance on the part of governments to maintain European and American excavations because of this long history of colonial looting, right, of archaeological artifacts. On the other hand, they're very excited to welcome Japanese excavators because they believe that they're going to be able to work with local scientists on a much more equitable footing. So there's a lot of diplomatic rhetoric that gets thrown around this archaeological excavation. For example, Prince Mikasa, he's the brother of Emperor Hirohito, was prominently involved in organizing these missions. And his memoirs of the 1956 expedition, so the first time they break ground on these Japanese excavation sites, he repeatedly highlights a shared Asian identity for Japanese, Iraqis, and Iranians. And he also sharply critiques in his own society a perception among post-war Japanese that Iraq and Iran are underdeveloped, that they're quite distinct from Japan, which has more successfully modernized and developed by the mid-20th century. So one quote from his memoir, he says, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, in the early days of Asia, when the ancient Orient was turning out splendid works of art, it was still midnight in Europe. In that sense, it's Europe that is a bad word. To be the other way around. Answering this, he says, is surely the essential problem confronting us Asians. Ajit is the term that he uses, Asian. So he's lumping together clearly Iranians and Iraqis in his concept of who Asians are. Meanwhile, in 1960, Mikasa's nephew, the Japanese crown prince, visits Iran, and on this occasion, Mohammad Reza Shah actually directly mentions the work of the Japanese archaeologists in a speech emphasizing long-term connections between Japan and Iran. So another quote from the speech that the Shah makes is, since 15 centuries ago, the two waves of Japanese and Iranian civilizations have met and influenced each other. The recent studies of your scientists and archaeologists, speaking to the Japanese, have shown that many works of Iranian art of the Sassanid era reached Japan and became a source of inspiration for Japanese artists, just as we have been inspired by Japanese works of art in our national arts. And for Mohammad Reza Shah to say such things, if you know anything about Iran, would be highly unusual, because he was absolutely like a Francophile, gung-ho argument. He really argued extensively that Iran is supposed to be a European country. And he even once said, a few years after this, that it's a geographical accident that Iran happens to be an Asian. So the fact that he's speaking to the Japanese in this way is remarkable. However, once you start looking at the macro scale of what's going on in these Japanese-Iranian scientific collaborations, of course, it's getting more complicated, right? So I don't have time to go into the details here, but we have records from the Japanese reports on the excavation, which are sent back to Tokyo, that the Japanese scientists are not getting along equally well with all of the different Iraqi and Iranian archaeologists that they're supposed to be working with. And there's also similar weird class dynamics, not weird, actually very predictable, between the Iraqi and Iranian scientists and the rural laborers who are hired to dig at these excavation sites. So there's a Japanese anthropologist who accompanies the archaeological excavations, and he takes advantage of this rift between for example, the Iranian liaison officers, the government representatives, and these poor rural Iranian diggers to gain their trust and get them to cooperate in what are actually anthropometric studies, right? So he's essentially doing racial anthropology on these laborers. And when he publishes this data, he casts them as essentially primitive representatives of Arab and Persian races. Another equally complex picture emerges from the Japanese government's formation of an overseas technical cooperation agency in 1962. So as you can imagine, there's something similar going on here to what there is with the American equivalent, right, Point 4. But the Japanese want to brand themselves as something outside of the Cold War dynamic of American and Soviet technical aid, okay? There's also, of course, specialists on East Asia have already outlined all kinds of neo-imperialist ways that Japan was trying to regain control, indirect ways over some of its former colonies in East Asia, right? But to my knowledge, no one has looked too closely at this agency's work in Iran. Okay? So in the later 1960s, this agency began organizing a program of collaborative medical research in Iran, and pointing out that Japan actually has very strong trade relations in Iran, and therefore it should make more of an effort, right, to help develop the country. So through this agency, the Japanese government selected one university, Gifu University, to partner with Tehran University. And the agency's reports on this attempt at organized collaboration detail a number of conflicts between what the Tehran University scientists wanted to gain out of this relationship versus what the Japanese hoped to gain. So for example, the Japanese scientists who are involved, they primarily want help to conduct medical research on Iranian patients. But what the Iranian scientists want out of this is actually just laboratory equipment. They're actually not super interested in joint research projects. Okay. So they're interested in kind of playing this Japanese technical aid organization in the same way that they, secure resources from American aid. Now, I'm still searching for personal records about the Iranian researchers involved in this collaboration beyond their scientific publications. But already within the publications record of some of these scientists, we can see that they don't actually consider the Japanese collaboration as important to them as their collaborations with European and American scientists, which are pursued in a more informal way. So for example, we have the case of Samuel Rathbar, who's actually quite a prominent hematologist. Starting in the late 1960s, Rathbar had been inspired by the British scientist Herman Lehman. So this is actually a picture of him visiting Lehman's office in Cambridge. And so he says, I'm going to do what layman is doing elsewhere in the world, and I'm going to start a search in Iran for hemoglobin variants among Iran's ethnically diverse population. So when he gets brought in to be sort of an Iranian delegate in this collaboration with the Japanese, the OCA program, the agency, provides his laboratory with an amino acid analyzer machine. And this machine is very helpful. It enables RAPBAR's new discovery of rapid discovery of a bunch of new hemoglobin variants throughout the 1970s. But remarkably, RAPBAR never acknowledges the source of this machine. So even though he describes what type of machine he used in his scientific publications, he doesn't acknowledge that he got it from the Japanese. In marked contrast to a different amino acid analyzer machine, which he sometimes references and says, I received this machine through MRC funding, Medical Research Council in Britain. Likewise, RAPBAR wrote many co-authored papers with British and American scientists, but only two with the Japanese, and he never really cites, even in his memoirs, anything about his work with the Japanese. We also see that in RAPBAR's online obituary that he, or at least his family members, considered that the machine he received from the Japanese government was a personal recognition of his achievements. But in contrast, we see that the Japanese agency's reports tell us that the provision of the equipment was supposed to support future joint projects between the Japanese and Iranian researchers. It wasn't a gift to RAPBAR. Okay. But this official collaboration between Gifu University and Tehran University just ends up kind of fizzling out completely by 1974. Okay. All that said, the Japanese do manage to accomplish some of the research that they wanted to do in Iran all along. So the Japanese, like RAPBAR, are in fact very keen to study hemoglobin variants in different parts of Iran. And they're interested in this because they want to determine racial relationships between East and West Asians. So in 1972, a team of Japanese scientists, they used this formal collaboration with Tehran University as a means to go and collect blood samples from these two ethnically defined groups in northern Iran. But so far, I only have Japanese sources, not Iranian sources yet, to appreciate the micro scale of these. So Ito Yuki, the head of the Japanese team, he wrote a very detailed report describing the fieldwork experience, showing some of the disagreements and conflicts that emerged in the scientific collaboration. So for example, a repeated theme is that Iranian researchers are very frustrating to the Japanese because they seem to be very disorganized and slow. They're constantly saying, inshallah, this will happen. They don't want to solve problems as they emerge, but only when the need becomes very urgent. Okay. Meanwhile, the Iranian physician who accompanies them to northern Iran starts to complain that the Japanese members are getting too friendly with the Jeep drivers. Okay, because the Japanese like to clap and sing along with the Jeep drivers at the end of the day when they're dancing around the dinner fire. And by doing that, the Japanese are undermining the Iranian doctor's authority. Okay, so here we see some resonances again of Gaidashek's experience with Bahmanyar. So wrapping this up, we're going to try to understand where does this go in the long term. So we see that the Iranians end up not really publishing or doing anything very significant with the data that's collected in the supposedly joint project in Iran. It's the Japanese who take this data and they really run with it. And they incorporate what they've collected from Iran into many different kinds of scientific publications and even popular books. But what these books and publications are supposed to be explaining has nothing to do with Iran, but actually it's supposed to be about the origins of the Japanese people. So for example, one of the team members who accompanied Ito to Iran, he sends on the Iranian blood samples that were collected, first to Tokyo, then to Osaka, where he has a colleague named Hideo Matsumoto. Now, Matsumoto, his big interest in the last decades of his career, was to participate in this national level Japanese research project about variation among the Japanese and neighboring peoples, okay? And so you can see that Iranian data is incorporated as like the westernmost point as part of this vast set of overseas collection missions that they have done. But the paper that this map comes from is specifically trying to talk about the origins of the Japanese people. Okay, and then when we look at the content of the, not just the maps and stuff, but the things that they actually write in their publications, reveal that the Japanese had a very different racial perception of the Iranians than the Iranians had about themselves, or indeed that the Europeans were publishing about Iranians at this point. So just a few quick clips from one paper in 1984, which is one of the only ones in which Rahbar is actually listed as a co-author. It's not 100% clear how much involvement he really had with writing the paper, because at that point he had left Iran. But we can look closely at ways in which there are certain tensions between the Iranian and Japanese perceptions of who are these people that they studied. So for example, the Iranians had long been invested in this idea that Iranians are Aryan, which for them means something very different, right, than Nazi Aryanism. Meanwhile, what the Japanese are actually interested in is this more macro level thing about the racial difference between Mongoloids and Caucasoids, and whether that could be detected at a genetic level. And so their conclusion to this paper is that these two ethnic groups in Iran, they are a mix of both Mongolian and Caucasoid sort of categories. However, they say, it seems that the Mongolian influence on their genetics is stronger than the and this is something that no Iranian authors writing on their own would ever have said about these two specific ethnic groups, which I could explain more later if anyone is interested. And then finally, Matsumoto publishes a trade book in 1992, which again, the title of the book is Where Do the Japanese People Come From? Okay, so again, it's a work about the origins of Japanese people. And he similarly has this explanation of who Iranians are, okay, that they basically belong to the white race, but they have a high portion of race mixture with northern type Mongol people. So this is a term that's really specific to his own project. So again, he's selectively incorporating data from this old collaboration and using it to prove a point within Japanese racial science. So there's really a lot left to analyze at both macro and micro scales, but really the nature of these Japanese-Iranian collaborations are important to understanding why the types of publications that end up coming out and the things they say are very different from ones produced by Iranian American or Iranian European coverage. Okay, so zooming back out to try to draw some overall concluding points here. So what I've tried to just start scratching the surface of by giving these, probably overly detailed examples, right? Is that by focusing on an idea of scientific collaboration, we're creating room for sort of richer histories of scientific, not only communication, but circulation, production of knowledge, circulation of resources, right? It opens up a way for us to think about all these things. And combining macro and micro scale critiques can help us with two of some of the main goals that we've had. One of which is to try to appreciate the contributions of what we might call neglected scientific actors. But as Jim said, we don't want to simply be in the business of like recovering voices of unknown people in that kind of simplistic way. In fact, what's really important that we do is that we also turn our critique onto the behavior of some of these so-called neglected actors, because we don't want to be writing hagiographies of what are really very complicated individuals and very complicated relationships. And then, of course, it also helps us reflect maybe a little bit more on our own collaborative practices as historians. I think many of us have reflected more and more in recent years about what it means to do history, right? And how we might better acknowledge the work of, for example, archivists and other kinds of actors who are invested in doing the same things we do, maybe better are doing the kinds of things that Jim said we should do, you know, communicating to different audiences, right? And so I will end here so that we can finally go to lunch by acknowledging someone else who I would probably acknowledge as a collaborator. So this is Tomokisa Sumida, who has helped me very much during my work in Japan. And so even though he answered a call in which I was requesting a Japanese research assistant, so I'm paying him as much as I can pay, but he really deserves to be acknowledged as a historian in his own right. So that's something that I'm reflecting on as I do my historical work. Thank you.
Thank you, Elise, and you guys can get Elise's award-winning book, Genetic Crossroads, the Middle East and the Science of Human Heredity, from Princeton University Press. Stanford, close enough.